Chapter 50 The Eternal Skirmish. Trig knew that the Resonance Cascade could never stand up to the Caldorix in a direct confrontation, so instead, Trig sought to make the simple act of crossing a star system as difficult as possible. Resonance Cascade, an Eventide volunteer, began subjecting Caldorix and her escort fleet to a series of hit-and-run attacks, spaced out over many hours, keeping the enemy in a constant state of alert. Headshot asteroids were Trig's weapon of choice. He knew the Cascade had finite ammunition and planned around this detail. The enemy fleet adopted evasive tactics, zigzagging their course and refusing to fly straight lines. Nearly all of the headshot asteroids missed their marks, but after several attempts, one of the two remaining escorts was finally hit. The enemy warship was not destroyed, but it was so badly damaged that Caldorix and her one remaining escort turned back to collect survivors before resuming their course. Caldorix and her final escort gave up on the shortest route to Ferrous Faucets, instead opting for a long and winding journey around the Nethupa star system, harassed from afar at infrequent intervals. In the old days, there were no rules or regulations stating when a crew was allowed to rest, Ponico explained. Camber can keep his men at battle stations for as long as he desires, even if they begin to collapse from exhaustion, which did happen a few times during the war. Really? Bromley said. Why didn't the Nagyari ever learn from that? Surely Ralpakin would have noticed and done something. Oh, the Khan certainly noticed, Ponico said, but he chose to uphold the satrapi system. Those whom Malum trusted to command and rule in his stead were permitted to conduct themselves however they wished, so long as they remained supremely loyal to the Khan himself. Alex was never reprimanded for running his men ragged, and never learned another way to command. 40 hours had passed since the first attack on the Caldorix fleet. There were several long breaks in the action where Eventide Volunteer disengaged and moved far away from the chase, making final preparations for the boarding action. During this time, Resonance Cascade would emerge from hiding, flying at the outermost limits of Caldorix's sensor range, doing her best to keep far away. Cascade was not alone during these maneuvers. The tiny little racing ship Mirage, confiscated from Radier's Solark, was put to good use. There were no people aboard the Mirage. The racing pinnace was being flown by a copy of Chef, the Cascade's autonomous crew member. He had very specific orders from Trig. Fly at the Caldorix and spam them with your radar. Make them think you're an incoming torpedo. Chef was not a torpedo AI, not by any stretch of the imagination. But he could do a very good impression of one, and the crew of the Cascade helped him out as best as they could. The Mirage had been stripped down. Since there was only going to be a robotic crew member, the life support system was removed, along with most of the amenities and outer layer of hull plating. The lightweight racer was now even lighter and faster than before. Mirage would descend toward Caldorix at high speed, often approaching a fraction of a percentage of the speed of light. From the cockpit, the copy of Chef would lock the ship's radar onto Caldorix, which would cause multiple alarms to go off on the enemy vessel and provoke a countermeasure response. Caldorix would launch decoys and activate its EW suite. Then, just before he got into range of the enemy's countermeasures, the copy of Chef would veer off and escape the scene. I've noticed a gap in the enemy's defenses, the copy of Chef reported after one such mission. What you got, Chef 2? Selborn asked, referring to the copy by nickname. The Caldorix will always respond to my approach by activating its electronic warfare suite, Chef 2 explained. However, the ECM signals aimed at myself from Caldorix would not be sufficient to scramble an actual torpedo. It is my opinion that the enemy's EW suite is either out of maintenance, improperly operated, suffering from a software error, or has sustained some kind of physical damage. Tactical Officer Brulon got an excited gleam in his eye and scrambled back into the cockpit. Trig had, over the past few months, learned that any show of serious emotion from Rulon meant that something serious was about to happen. 50 hours had elapsed since the start of the skirmish. Aboard the Resonance Cascade, Rulon, Glossum, and Trig worked in shifts at the electronic warfare suite. The ship was now broadcasting a constant beam of electromagnetic waves at Caldorix. The enemy responded in kind, but it was a losing battle. Aboard the Sutherian ship, EM interference manifested in the form of the occasional sensor malfunction, where the Caldorix would have its IFF status changed to friendly. These incidents were infrequent and easy to guard against. Meanwhile, the situation aboard the Caldorix was worse, and Trig felt a sick kind of joy knowing that he was responsible for it. "How's it going?" Trig asked as he took over the EW suite from Rulon. "It's just like you said," Rulon replied with a yawn. "They've had so many false alarms, they're starting to ignore Chef 2 whenever he does a flyby, and they're not reacting to the cascade at all." Trig patted Rulon on the shoulder. "I'll take this watch," he said. "Please make sure everyone on our ship is getting a full night's sleep. I'll tell Chef 1 to make a double-sized breakfast in the morning." Rulon smiled at Trig. "Look at you, kid. You might be a skirmisher right now, but you're shaping up to be a little con." Trig waited until Rulon was gone. Then he shuddered. He did not want to imagine himself as anything like Malum Ralpakin. Trig divided his attention. He manipulated the EW controls, trying to trick the crew of the Caldorix into thinking Cascade had just fired a salvo of torpedoes. Trig also projected his psionic powers across the ship. He telepathically checked in with each crew member, making absolutely certain that everyone was fully rested, well-fed, and in good spirits. The crucial moment was almost here. Aboard the Caldorix, there was hell. Only a small handful of men had gotten more than 2 hours of sleep over the past week. The crew was exhausted, physically and mentally. A near-constant barrage of alarms and alerts had disrupted both meal and sleep schedules to such a point that order and discipline were beginning to break down. The ship had been at battle stations for almost 72 hours. Hundreds of Nagyari had collapsed at their stations. Medics ran ragged, reviving their shipmates without rest. Gun crews were at their wits' end. The bridge kept raising the alarm about incoming attacks, only for no such threat to materialize. Already, 3 fights had occurred aboard the ship as the crew began snapping and lashing out at one another. Alex had personally executed one of the belligerents to set an example. To make matters worse, the Caldorix was falling out of maintenance very quickly. The crew was exhausted, unable to focus and unable to do their work due to the frequent warnings of incoming attack. Each time a torpedo or asteroid was detected, the Caldorix would drop its airtight bulkhead doors and brace for impact, only for nothing to happen. Finally, after 3 days of false alarms, the chief of the watch gave permission for the crew to ignore certain safety rules. Now, when a threat was detected, the bulkhead doors would not be closed, spacesuits would not be donned, and certain countermeasures would not be activated. This was all to reduce stress and free up crewmen for badly neglected maintenance tasks. Even Alex was feeling the strain. Ever since the very first attack near the gas giant 72 hours ago, Alex had only slept for 6 hours total. He forced himself to meditate, to transmute his immense mental willpower into physical strength. "I have come this far. I will not fail my master's vision now," Alex told himself. "I will persevere." At the outermost limits of his perception, Alex could sense a wave of distress. At first, he worried a brawl had erupted in the cafeteria, which had shut down at the beginning of the skirmish and would not serve food again until the order to stand down from battle stations. But on closer examination, Alex realized the panicked emotions were emanating from the harem chambers. Alex discovered the telepath assigned to keep Tenna complacent had collapsed from exhaustion. As soon as the man passed out, the girl's blissful telepathic prison had vanished. Tenna was suddenly aware of the fact that she was not being fed, that her clothes and bedsheets were no longer being cleaned. But underneath this sudden onset of panic, Alex noticed something else. Listening through the door, Alex could hear Tenna screaming, "Don't go! Please come back! I'll do anything, please!" Inside the harem chamber, Tenna had fallen to her knees, crying into the side of her bed. "Come back!" she wailed. "Please, I can't go on without you." Slipping through the ventilation shaft, a wispy purple cloud entered the room, swirling around the floor until it took shape. This was not Malum Raupakin, the great Khan who conquered most of the luminous frontier 15 years ago. This was a shadow of him, a telepathic echo. If Tenna was not on the brink of starvation, if her willpower was not broken down by the preceding weeks of torment and manipulation, perhaps she might have seen through the illusion. Instead, Tenna looked upon this facsimile and saw exactly what she wanted to see. Still on her knees, Tenna shuffled across the floor until she was in front of Malum Raupakin. "You know what you must do," the great Khan said. Tenna placed her hands on the floor and dipped her head low. She kowtowed to the great Khan 3 times, then gently kissed one of his boots. "Be my Aethera," Tenna whispered. "I'll be yours forever."